Okay, I'm just going to start now. I think some lunchtime stragglers might turn up. We'll see. Thanks for coming today. The session is about taking SharePoint 2010 offline. So hopefully you're in the right room for that. And I'm going to cover a few things today. One of which is so I'm going to cover the business problem, why we might want to take SharePoint offline, what sort of cases we might want to do this, some of the solutions that come out of the box, Microsoft's answer to the offline problem that we might have, and then some custom solutions, including one of the ones that we've implemented recently for a client. And I'll give a case study and demo of that at the end. And I'm actually going to hand over to my colleague. Unfortunately, our client, Heineken UK, have got some other engagements, not quite as exciting as the SharePoint conference, only the Champions League and the Heineken Cup final to attend to. So they apologise for not being here, but my colleague David is there on behalf of the client to explain the situation and how this project and this solution architecture came about.
Thanks, Gus. Good afternoon. My name's David Gardner. I'm the CEO of Unitech. Gus is the CTO of our organisation. And Gus and I have been involved in this project for just over a year now, working with Heineken. And we're going to use that as the example as to show you how we've taken some of that issue for them about getting SharePoint out onto laptops and away from the connected environment. What I thought I would do, first of all, just to waken you all up, is, as you can see here, if anybody recognises the brand, I know these guys will because I saw their badges. They're from Europe. What I'd like to do is hand them out. So what I'm going to do is just ask you a few questions, get you to understand the size of this organisation. The first one, does anybody know how long Heineken has been in existence? When did they form? How many years? You guys are not allowed. Anybody else that's not from Holland? 100 years. Anyone else?
400 years.
What was that?
400.
No, 100 years is about right.
1873.
1863. Yeah, you're out by 10 years. I'm going to give this man, and it's still cold. We're keeping it on the fridge there. So it's been going for a long, long time. A high reputation formed by Gerard Heineken back then. And the Heineken family are still involved in the organisation. And their motto is, we are a brand-led business. They're all about the brand. This is the second question. Does anybody know how many brands Heineken own? 14, 50, 30. One more.
20.
Who said 40? Oh, who? Many did you say? 50.
40.
Over 200. Would you mind passing that back? Over 200 brands are owned by Heineken. And these are examples of them. This is 4 of what they call their Super 6. So Heineken, Foster's, Kronenbourg, Strongbow, Bulmers, and the other one is John Smith's. They're what they call their Super 6. So finally, the last 2 questions hand out these. Anybody know what the turnover of the business was last year? Would you reckon the turnover on a worldwide scale?
360 degrees.
361. You're just out. But no, anybody get an idea in euros what the turnover of the business is? Quickly.
7 billion.
7 billion. One more. 100 and... No, we'll give it to 7 billion. Who said that? You've already got one. Anybody else? Give me a shout.
15.
These guys, yeah, 16. 16 billion in turnover to the business. He's been very close. And very last one, what's the biggest market? Where is the market the strongest? Where is the biggest growth market, should I say? Probably.
Africa. Brazil. India.
No. India's closest. Who said India? You've already got one. Who said China? That man at the back. Somebody that's not got. I'm going to give it to this lady at the front. There you are. Have a beer. You can hand it out. But Asia is the biggest growth market at the moment. It's probably no surprise. The Chinese are switching on. So that's the company. Sizable company, big turnover, lots of brands. How do we manage content and information within an organisation that size? Well, the first thing that we did, if I can get the... Is it up the way?
Right. Drunk. Right.
Hey, no, we're going backwards. Here we go. It's a brand-led business, and we're all about initially doing better business internally. They weren't too bad. They're a Lotus Notes house. They run Domino, Lotus Notes, Notes Mail. As of January this year, they're going to replace the whole Lotus Notes estate with SharePoint and Exchange. So Lotus Notes is gone, SharePoint's taking over. And the reason for that partly was our involvement. They came to us last year with an issue around emailing documents about the organisation. 10 to 15 megabyte PowerPoints going out to 300-400 people at a time. And if one bit's wrong and they have to redo it, out it goes again. How do we centralise that? So we created this little brand planning portal for them, integrated commercial planning. So that number of people now can pick up their content now from within here. Master templates. We did an ask the question. We also got managing learnings, any shared learnings people can post up. So all of a sudden, this email culture came down to let's use the portal to collaborate. That project actually was completed within 10 days. Came to us on a Monday. They had to present in Holland. We did it in 10 days, got them up and running, and we've just gone through a phase 2 revamp in January this year. The second one was a career mapping. Again, within the finance area, we wanted something which was more aesthetically pleasing. Using PowerPoint again to distribute content, we now put it into this nice little portal where it's much more pleasing. It's got good user experience. It manages information and presents it in this application style, all running within SharePoint. The third area of interest for them about tail end of last year is hospitality. And again, we wrote this application using SharePoint 2010, to help them manage a £10 million investment in corporate hospitality. They had no idea who was using all these tickets to the Champions League, the Heineken Cup, the derbies, the golf, whatever they were sponsoring, a lot of Premiership sponsors. How do you manage that? How do we get a return of investment from that? This little application, again, it was a 25 to 30 man day exercise to design this, build it, and implement it, to allow them to manage the corporate entertainment, who's using it. And the big thing for them was VAT. How do we manage the return of VAT? They got a big fine a couple of years ago because they were letting people use it. Corporate entertainment's non-recoverable, and they were recovering that VAT. So this solved 2 problems for them. So this was internal. So this is us addressing, as you can see there, different aspects of the business's issues. And finally, just before Christmas, competence and competence development. We created and generated this little application, fully in SharePoint again. As you can see, nice look and feel. Doesn't look like the SharePoint out the box. SharePoint 2010. A guide for managing the competence across the whole organisation in the UK. So 4 different aspects of how SharePoint has influenced that organisation. I think the profits were up 49% last year. Hopefully we're going to add 1% to that, which on a 16 billion turnover isn't too bad, actually. But what's happened more recently, I think it was probably October, November last year, this whole issue, they've got a very distributed workforce. They're up and down the country, UK-wide. They bought Scottish in Newcastle. Good Scottish, gone. But it's now owned by Heineken. And that meant in the UK, 2,500 people that we have to get this information out to. And one of the big things is all this SharePoint was internal. Some of it was hosted. We're a hosting company, so we put the first couple of apps were on our hosted server. But what they wanted to do was get information out of SharePoint onto people's laptops, particularly for what they call their off-trade activity. People walking into pubs with their laptops to show clients why they're using the Heineken brand, what the brands are. And as you've all been surprised, a lot of pub owners are the same. They actually own 2,500 pubs in the UK as well. So the big issue, and Gus is going to walk through this with you just now, was how do we do business better offline? And this is a view of what that application looks like in an offline mode and connected in an online mode. But I'm not going to steal Gus's thunder. I'm going to hand back to Gus and let him explain all.
Thanks, Dave. Okay, so the business problem, I think many of us will have been there. But just before we start, I'd just like to find out what the sort of audience makeup is. I think I've categorized them into 3. There's coders, so that's people who write a little bit of code. Ex-coders, maybe salespeople or management now. And non-coders. So I'm just wondering, can I get a show of hands for people who write code? Okay, ex-coders and non-coders. Okay, good. So there's a good mix in the audience. The reason I wanted to ask that is so I can make sure I cover the sort of the business angle, maybe the user interface angle, and also the technical element. So I will be showing you a little bit of code as well. Hopefully it won't put you off. If you might have been on one of these before, it's meant to have a sign like this. All you get is this. So, you might be familiar with that problem. And I know it's frustrating for me. It's very frustrating for a sales force that rely on this business tool to do their job. How are they meant to do it? Because they came from a Lotus Notes background, which had probably the only thing that it did better than SharePoint was replication. So it had some inbuilt technology that allowed them to take their business tools offline with them. And so this is one of the challenges that we've faced with any Lotus house is trying to give them comparable or rather better functionality in SharePoint. So again, another example, you might have been in the pub enjoying a SharePoint pint. There's meant to be Wi-Fi signs, and you get this again. It's frustrating, especially when you're doing your job. So we come on to some of the out-of-the-box solutions that come with Microsoft SharePoint 2010. And the first one of which is local drafts. If you use SharePoint already, you're probably familiar with this. Basically, it's a local copy of documents. You need to remember to download the copy and check it out, basically. You've got version control, check documents in and out. It's available on Office 2007 and upwards. So I think most of you are probably familiar with that. You can also choose where you want to save the offline copy of documents in your drafts. So these are just out-of-the-box features, fairly straightforward, no configuring. The next option is something that's new, but it's not really new. It's kind of an evolution of what was there before. So it basically succeeds Groove 2007. How many of you have ever used Groove? Excellent, right, that's a surprisingly high number. It didn't have the success in the enterprise as people had hoped, but that's good. So you're familiar with that. Groove was basically a solution that Microsoft developed to allow people to synchronize workspaces with colleagues more than synchronize it with SharePoint, which is what I'm going to show you. It basically comes as a standalone client. You can buy it separately, but I think the only place to buy it as a standalone client is the online shop. Alternatively, it comes with Office Professional Plus 2010. So that's something to be aware of. It doesn't come out of the box with SharePoint or out of the box with maybe the standard SKUs of Office. And in Microsoft's words, it's really a client application and it allows access to document libraries and lists on SharePoint Server 2010 and Foundation 2010. That means you don't need to have a standard version of SharePoint or enterprise CALs, basically. You can use it with any version of SharePoint, which is good. In fact, the demos I'll be doing today are on Foundation. So there are different workspace types. SharePoint Workspaces is what's kind of new to the table with SharePoint 2010. You can synchronize whole lists and libraries offline, basically. You can take them offline and take them with you. You have Groove Workspaces, which I don't think has changed, actually, from the 2007 version, so there's not really any change in functionality there that would allow you to synchronize workspaces with colleagues and collaborate in such a manner. And then Shared Folder Workspaces, as the name suggests, is a way of sharing your folders, basically your local desktop, no SharePoint or anything like that. You can just share your local folders. But you cannot sync everything. That's a list. You can't sync all of these items. But having said that, you can still get a lot of use out of syncing document libraries and lists and custom lists. So I'm not going to go through that whole list of what you cannot sync. What I'm going to show you is what you can sync. So I'm going to give you a quick demo of SharePoint Workspace 2010. Okay, so I have here just a team site. There's nothing special. In it, I've got some documents that I would like to sync. So it's just a document library with some documents in there. And you'll be familiar with the ribbon at the top of the page. What you can do is you can click on the Sync to SharePoint workspace. And that allows me to open it with SharePoint workspace. And it basically shows me the content of that document library. I can take this document library offline as well. And basically, when I'm offline, I can make changes to these documents. So I can make offline copies. It actually comes up with a nice tooltip. It tells me when it was last updated, earlier this morning. So I can just carry on and make some more changes. So I can save that. I've saved the document, and it's got an upload pending. So it's actually telling me my changes were saved, but they couldn't be uploaded because the server could not be contacted. That's because I've said I'm working offline, basically. So what's going to happen now is I'm going to get online at some point, and at that point, I'm going to need to upload my content back to SharePoint. But I'm not really going to have to think about that too much, because in the background, it actually says uploading to the server, and it actually takes advantage of the Microsoft Office Upload Center, which I don't know whether you've seen, but this will actually show you any pending uploads that you have. So when you're using SharePoint Workspace, all your uploads will appear in this Upload Center, and that's the same as if you're using your drafts and you're trying to save things as well. So they should appear in the Upload Center for you to check out, and it will take care of uploading them when you get back online at a later date. So I go back to my document library and just refresh the page. My document's been updated. And that's great. Single user using SharePoint Workspace to work on some content when I'm away from the office, perhaps with a little bit more context than simply just saving something locally to my local drafts. Now the problem's going to occur when you have multiple users with multiple workspaces all trying to edit the same documents. And at that point, there's no clever conflict resolution. You'll need to choose what do you want to do. So do you want to save your document you've been working on, or perhaps one that's been updated more recently from the server? So that was it as far as document management is concerned. You can actually also sync some lists as well. So I can go to a list. Here I've got a list of some Heineken brands. And I can sync this to SharePoint Workspace as well. Now what's happening is it's going to open up SharePoint Workspace, and I've got the option to synchronize this. The first time you do it, initializing it, it'll take a little second, and then I would then be free to make similar changes using more of an InfoPath form style form for you to edit the list data there.
Right, just step back to document management. Content types.
Yeah.
You've got a content type on the list, and you download the document library to Workspace. Does it remember the content types? Does it prompt you to tag when you're working offline? So I might create a new document offline, and I might save it into my document library in Workspace.
Are you talking about field validation and the basically like the document information panel?
Three of those will be 5 fields.
Yep.
When I re-upload it, those fields got to specify.
Yeah.
How
Okay.
does it handle the whole kind of content type tagging?
So you're editing your document as if it was you're using SharePoint Workspace as a mechanism for syncing it with SharePoint, but you're editing your document as if it was. So the way that you could, yeah.
So does the document already have to exist in SharePoint for it to be synced, or could I create a new document and put it into Workspace waiting for it to get online?
You can create a new document. So I can actually create a new document here, and by doing that, it will allow me to use my content type was a document in that occasion. So if there are changes to the content types in between syncing, then you're going to get some kind of conflict resolution as well that you'll need to.
They're just standard content.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So in my experience, you can't, using SharePoint Workspace, modify the fields of or enter values in the content type. So if you're here in this example, you're editing a Word document. So because it's coming from SharePoint, you would have the content type
Document information panel. Yeah, yeah.
But if you were editing something else and you had required fields, then it eventually wouldn't work.
Yeah, so the Microsoft Office Upload Center will attempt to upload your document to the document library as if it was you, basically. So you'll get the same issues trying to get that document to upload. It's not going to be able to fill in fields and so on. But
as long as it respects the content types, that's kind of...
yeah, it's not going to it's not going to allow you to override the rules applied to a document library, for example, by uploading the wrong content. Okay. So that was a quick demo of SharePoint Workspace. Sorry.
Choose which document libraries to sync?
Yes, absolutely. No. So you can choose what within a site. You can choose whichever items you like. So you don't need to synchronize the whole site. You can synchronize a document library, a list, as long as it's not calendar types or event types. The majority of a team site that I was using, you can sync.
The whole book library in one chunk, isn't it?
Yeah, you can't choose to sync one document or two documents. You can choose to sync the library itself. Back again. So now I'm going to talk about a little bit more about some custom solutions, which is what we found was required in this case. The reason for that was the SharePoint Workspace interface looks like it's maybe could be a part of Outlook in a future version. It's kind of like a business interface for business people, and that's okay if you're not too interested in the look and feel. But what we were trying to do was build something that looked really nice. So you can't really customize SharePoint Workspace's look and feel. You couldn't potentially bring it to your audience and say, look at these amazing documents. You're basically going to be stuck with what your document libraries had. Whereas if you've got a custom solution, maybe akin to branding SharePoint 2010 from a UI and a front-end perspective. So that was one of the reasons why we basically decided we couldn't use Workspace in this instance. And also, we wanted a little bit more control over what was happening with the data, which we weren't getting with Workspace. So the problem is not getting the data in. That's actually really easy with SharePoint 2010. Most users have no problem at all with editing standard lists and documents within SharePoint. It's then pulling the data out. And with 2010, there were some real improvements in that area over 2007, where it was nearly always more or less a homebrew effort to try and get data out in a consistent way. So there are some APIs now that you can use, the client object model APIs, which can be used to retrieve data in certain instances. The JavaScript, the .NET, and the Silverlight client object models are all slightly different, and they all serve their purpose. What that means as a developer means that you can target the list much more easily without having to call custom web services. There's also the SharePoint native API, so that's really executing code on the server. You'd still need to get that content that you're retrieving from SharePoint. You still need to get that out because, as any developers probably know, you can't really run SharePoint code when you're not on the SharePoint server. So you still need to use a WCF service or something like that to extract it. One of my favorite improvements, or enhancements rather, is SP Metal, which is a tool that you can use to run against the SharePoint site and end up with strongly typed classes that represent your data. And it also allows link, so link not LYNC but LINQ, language integrated querying, and that is a really powerful way of running any queries. It's testable as well, so for anyone into unit testing, that can be really a great benefit. And of course, once you get your data out, what are you going to do with it? You need a service of some kind. We use WCF services, Windows Communication Framework. It's fairly flexible. You can call it from a console app, from a Silverlight app, from a WPF app, from another website if necessary. So the client object model actually calls a service under the hood. So what you'll find if you interrogate, if you have a look with Fiddler or other debugging tools, you can see what's actually going on under the hood when you use a client object model. And it's calling a service, a WCF service. And any of the client applications call that same service, but there are limitations in the APIs. The JavaScript client object model, it must be hosted within a SharePoint page. So authentication is performed by virtue of the request that is being made at the time. There's no conditional scope. Conditional scope is something that allows you to make requests conditionally, as the name would suggest, which can be quite useful calling the client object model from both the Silverlight or the .NET client object model. But again, it's limited use for a disconnected client because you need to be running it on a web page. Next is the Silverlight client object model. This is the one that we opted for. Sorry, no, we didn't opt for the Silverlight client object model. We considered it. It can be run from a Silverlight web part or from within a custom web page. Using RAA services, you can actually extrapolate some of that data and run it remotely. But you actually need to use an external application provider if you're going to run things cross-domain, which is a little bit fiddly to set up. It's not the end of the world, but the standard ways of having a cross-domain or client access policy won't work within SharePoint. For the security model prohibits that. So it's just something to be aware of. So it can be used out of browser. So this is the sort of first solution that we could have potentially used. You need a local cache if you're going to store things offline, of course. So we use isolated storage for that. The next option is the .NET CLR client object model. So this could be used from any number of applications, a WPF or any application that really uses the full .NET framework. The managed API references are actually only total about 0.5 meg rather than the Microsoft SharePoint DLL. So what that means is when you're deploying applications, you're actually dealing with a cut down version. You don't get everything in it, but there are benefits as well to just using the client object model, a subset of the data, if you like. So it can be executed remotely. And then there's a SharePoint native API, which must be executed on a SharePoint server. So that was a limitation that we had in 2007 again. It's very similar, in fact. There are not huge improvements here. There's no limitations, so you can run elevated privileges. And it's typically, again, combined with a WCF service. Now, onto SP Metal. This is one of the things that I like to use to generate some classes. It works on SharePoint Foundation, so you don't actually need server CALs or enterprise CALs for this. And it's a command line tool that queries the SharePoint site and generates entity classes for your models, so for your lists and your document libraries and so on, and strongly typed access to SharePoint data. What that means is that you can actually use the data natively within your application. So rather than using list objects, document objects, you can use, in Heineken's example, you can use brands and you can use brand categories. And instead of needing to look at the list data itself, so SP list and all the SharePoint native objects, you can actually turn them into your domain business objects. And that's really useful when you're dealing with a distributed team of developers and you've got teams working on the front end that just want to bind to something that makes sense, like a brand rather than an SP item or a SP something or other. So we found that particularly useful in this case. And it's very similar to link to SharePoint, so it allows that language integrated query. You can query it. It's kind of like SQL, but it's in .NET basically. I'll show you a couple of examples of that shortly. And Visual Studio integration, so you can actually use SP Metal as an external tool with some parameters and quickly generate any changes that you're making to your to your server-side SharePoint lists and content types, you can just run the tool from within Visual Studio, and you've got your classes already generated. SP Metal can take some parameters as well, so you can customize these entity classes. You don't have to accept what comes out of the box. You can include and exclude some content types from your SharePoint site, and you can include and exclude columns. That's a quick example of a very short SP Metal parameters file where you can see that I've decided I want a list called lagers and I want the content type called drink. But actually what I'm doing here is I'm saying I want it to be rendered as a class called lager. So I'll be telling my Silverlight or WPF developers to bind to some classes called lager. And I also decided that I want to include some columns that don't come out of the box with no parameters, which are the useful and native properties of all items within SharePoint created and modified. But I'd want to exclude the column called notes. So it's fairly simple. It is limited as well. Doesn't allow you to customize it to the nth degree, but it allows enough flexibility for us to use, certainly. So onto SharePoint and custom WCF. Now, I talked about getting the data out of SharePoint. How do you actually then retrieve it from your application code that's using SP Metal, for example? SharePoint allows for dynamic endpoints. What this means is that you don't have to modify your SharePoint web configs. You can actually use SharePoint itself to host the endpoints that support SOAP and REST or WCF data services. These service host factory implementations are really what's allowing you to implement your WCF service with these dynamic endpoints without having to write your custom bindings. Anyone who's familiar with WCF and bindings, trying to incorporate that into a SharePoint web config can be problematic. It's much easier to use these endpoints. It's fairly straightforward. So one of the tools that we use as well, one of the suites of tools, I should say, for any developers is CKS Dev. Some of the guys on the team are here this week. And it basically allows you to take shortcuts it's Visual Studio extensions that will allow you to create SharePoint solutions faster. And one of the things that it allows you to do is create a WCF service. So if you're a developer, you've got Visual Studio, you can download this for free, and one of the extensions is a WCF service. So it's really just a template of how you would implement a WCF service, and means that you don't need to go through sometimes the pain of getting all the service implementation set up correctly. And there are foundation and server versions of CKS Dev as well, so you can implement that on any version of SharePoint. So I'm going to give you a quick demo now of SP Metal and WCF and Link. Okay, so I'm going to show you my Visual Studio solution, which has got within it a service and a service implementation, which has just got one method. It's implementing my, as all WCF services need to have a service contract. So my implementation has got a single method in it called be a collection that's been decorated as an operation contract. And then I've actually got my implementation of this interface as well, which is going to get a list of beers, really. Nothing more complicated than that. But what's interesting about this is that I can use this data context. And what is this BPC data context? That was generated automatically by SP Metal. So I'm going to show you how I went about doing that. The tool called SP Metal, I've added it as an external tool. So I've got SP Metal BPC. And if I show you the configuration of this, you can see that the command is actually within your program files, within the 14 hive and within the bin folder. So the executable is there. And you can add some parameters. The arguments that I've added are the website, web BPC. What I want is my classes to be serializable, so that I can send them over WCF more easily. I want my output class to be SP Metal entities.cs. and I want it to take a parameters file. So I want it to take this parameters file called SP-metal parameters, and I want the directory that it's going to generate these classes to be the project directory. So I've gone ahead and created my external tool. What I'll do is now I'll just run it. And what that's going to do is it will tell me, oh, it's been modified because SP-metal has now generated my entity classes. That's great. So I've got my classes. What else can I do? I can create a data context. So what I've got is a method that's going to create this BPC data context. Now, if I have a look at my SP-metal parameters, which is really quite a small list of parameters, I can see the output class that I wanted to generate was this BPC data context. So that's really what I'm going to create an instance of from my service method. I create a data context. It takes as a parameter the URL of the site. And then I've got a hold of the site. I can actually start running some link queries. So this var query from beer in DAL beers, that's the data access layer, but it's really just that data context I just showed you. So it's really one line of code really to execute a query against SharePoint that then ends up with some native beer objects. Now this beer object is something that I could potentially bind to a Silverlight application, to a WCF application, WPF application, and we found it a lot more useful than trying to retrieve some SP items or SharePoint native items that have got a whole lot of fields that you need to cast as something to make them usable in a line of business application. So within 3 lines of code, really, I query it, and then I'm going to turn the query to an array, and then I'm going to add to my beer collection, which is really just a collection of beers, and I'm going to retrieve it. So it's a small amount of code to retrieve the data. Before SP-metal, we would have had to write some custom web services maybe to retrieve some SP items, cast all the SP items as our custom objects, and then send them over the wire. But what's nice about this is any changes to the line of business application within SharePoint, I can reproduce within my application here in a matter of seconds, really, because any time I execute SP-metal, I'm generating a new set of entity classes. So that's the service side of things. I've also got a console app to demonstrate this. The console app itself just has a service reference, which actually, if I configure that service reference, it's going straight to the service within SharePoint. Important thing to note about the service is that you must, to make use of this, put MEX at the end, metadata exchange point. So if I actually go to this in a browser, I'll be able to see basically my WSDL view of my methods that I would be able to execute. So this is what Visual Studio is interrogating when I add my service reference. And as a result of that, when I want to execute some beers from my program, all I need to do is create a binding. So I create a binding, call the method on the service after I've created my endpoint address, which is within SharePoint, and use the proxy that I've created to retrieve all the beers. So it's quite a simple example, but I'll show you that working. So the beer that we saw earlier, which I'll go back to. So we've got some beers here: Heineken, Kronenbourg, Foster's, and John Smith's, and I can make changes in this list. Say increase the alcohol content. And if I then reload my console application, run this again. Okay, the demo. That should have picked up my change. I think the main point about this was not my console application anyway. It was generating the entity classes from your SharePoint list, where you've actually got some real objects to deal with. So if I go to my console application, I can have a look at my beer's title and so on. So I can have a look that all the options that I've got. I've got the alcohol content, the country, and the title. And then what that allows me to do is to bind that much more easily to something like a WPF or Silverlight application. Whereas with an SP item, I would have had to cast every property of that SP item to something useful and relevant that I can then make sense of. And as a designer, I don't know what an SP item is a lot of the time. I just want to know, give me a model that I can work with.
In the solution behind it, were there users who could manage lists who could actually go and change columns?
Yeah, so we haven't got to the point where they're making changes. The application is being launched at the start of May, so we haven't got to that point yet. But when we do, the process will be that they'll make changes as they can within a SharePoint site, as you can with any SharePoint site, and we'll need to then run our SP Metal against it and change some bindings in Silverlight. But we won't have to change. We won't have to change a lot of the plumbing because our entity classes are going to just represent the model that they've changed it to. So we've given them flexibility, and we'll see what happens. But I think it's a wait and see for that one. I don't think that there'll be a huge number of changes, but in the development process it was quite iterative, so we had a lot of changes throughout the whole process, and in that case it worked quite well because we could give them access to a SharePoint site, say have a play with this, add some more columns if you've got some more data to add, and there were 5 or 6 different stakeholders that all had different interests. So each one would say, well, I need some data about these brands in this way, and when I show you the application it will kind of make sense.
So over the out-of-the-box solutions, what big benefit of what you're doing here in terms of custom data?
The big benefit is the customization of the user interface, the customization of the granular control that you'd have over what to synchronize, when to synchronize it, and particularly if we were going to use the out-of-the-box solutions for a Silverlight application, you need to write a fair bit of code anyway to get your code synchronized offline. So we found that the SP Metal kind of did its job for us, and I think it was the development cycle that we noticed it in particular. So when they were making changes, we didn't need to rewrite a whole load of code to represent that in our application. And when you kind of have a more of an agile development process when they're involved and the clients keeps wanting to make changes, we allow them to do that within certain parameters, and provided that there's if we had a custom application, we would have probably had to rewritten everything, or not rewritten everything, done a lot more custom code after each iteration, if you like.
With my consultant hat on, you walk off the project, then much documentation around to sort of support the SP Metal or whatever features you're using?
So if you contrast that with any other solution where you would have to have an equivalent amount of documentation, I don't see that this would be, if anything, this might even be easier because you could script the changes, you could script the SP Metal generating classes and so on. You would perhaps have less custom code to write if there were changes, whereas in a traditional scenario you would probably have a little bit more to write. So in either case, I think you're going to have. Yeah. Okay, so I'll get back to the. Sorry. So now onto the Silverlight client. Why did we build it? It's a low impact for IT. You can get access to the file system with Silverlight as well. You're limited to special folders, so they're basically within the My Documents folders. You can use isolated storage. Isolated storage is a way of saving data, application data, that we've taken advantage of. It's got out-of-browser capabilities in version 3 and upwards, version 4 particularly. And another thing that our developers liked was model view model, MVVM, which allows testability and separation of concerns basically from design to the to the actual code, so we could test the back-end code. And also Windows Phone 7. So it would be conceivable that the same kind of line of business application data would be relevant to mobile users. And on Windows Phone 7, it would be a very comparatively small amount of work to produce a client that would run on that, given that we're already running it in Silverlight anyway. It would be some UI changes, but none of the plumbing. So Silverlight 4 out of browser has the same small runtime. You can run it as an installed program, so you can have links on your desktop or on the start menu link. You can incorporate a web browser control when it's out of browser, which means that you can host HTML within your Silverlight app, which can be useful. We didn't find a need to take advantage of that. And the file system access I mentioned, and increased isolated storage. So out of the box, when you run a Silverlight application online, you'll get 1 megabyte of storage, which isn't a great deal. When you run it out of browser, you'll get 25 megabytes, which actually was sufficient for our application. But you can increase that. But when you increase it, you need to request that that limit is increased by the user. So it would be a step for 1,500 users to ask them to request more isolated storage. We were glad that we didn't have to do it, basically. One of the things that we're using is a Sterling isolated storage database, which is another Codeplex submission, and it allows you to serialize your objects much faster. So we can serialize them with our custom serializers if we like, but using isolated storage and the Sterling database, we're allowed to do that a lot quicker. We can also query it. We can use link again, and it works on Windows Phone 7 too. And in terms of MVVM, there are a lot of frameworks out there. You can write your own if you like. So we decided to evaluate a few, and the one that we preferred was Calibre and Micro. Again, found it on Codeplex. We could have written our own solution for MVVM, but we liked a lot of the conventions in Calibre and Micro, allowed for a really fast development process. The other ones we looked at were Jounce and MVVM Lite. So now to the case study. It's a sales tool for 1,500 salespeople, more than 20 brands. They have loads more brands worldwide, but particularly this is supporting about 30 of them. It replaces, and this is the key for them, replaces an expensive and out-of-date booklet that they used to release quarterly. So this was a book that the salespeople carry around with them. But the minute it's printed, after a 4-week development cycle, print cycle, and getting it all sorted out, the data would be out of date. So it really was not very useful for a very long time for them. So that was one thing that they wanted to replace. The requirement summary was, they said, can you give us a website in a box? Can SharePoint do this? And we thought about it. They said, can you manage the data easily? So with SharePoint now you get that. Can it update automatically? Sure, you can get that. And does it work offline? So again, that was coming back to the whole business problem that I've been talking about, which is trying to get SharePoint to work offline. So I'm going to show you a quick demo. So installs on the desktop, I've got it here, Heineken Star Planning. I've also saved it. So what was happening there in the background was I was loading a load of data from SharePoint. If I was offline, it would have used my Sterling isolated storage database that I was looking at. And basically just retrieves this data from SharePoint that includes data around consumer profiles and different types of outlets. So the idea is that everybody falls into a profile. Everybody drinks a certain type of drink. Those profiles drink those certain types of drinks on certain occasions in different venues. So you have this kind of matrix of prioritizing what you're trying to sell. As a person that owns a pub, you want to concentrate on the people that are drinking the most on certain occasions in your venue. And there are basically some brand fits. So you've got, depending on your outlet type, you've got a consumer profile category, and you've got occasions that they drink certain drinks within your establishment. And the salesperson's job is to convince the person buying that, in fact, yes, these consumer profiles do drink in my bar on these occasions, so therefore the brands that I should be selling are, for example, Foster's. So this is not full of data at the moment, but it just gives an example of, it actually gives a fairly good user experience from someone selling to somebody buying within the pub. It's quick, it's snappy, because it's already loaded the data, so everything is there already. You don't need to wait for page loads. It works offline. So these are some of the things they liked. A little bit of animation, not too much, just enough. Gives it that kind of nice look and feel that was going to enable the salespeople to replace this booklet, which was a nice glossy booklet, but it was expensive to maintain and so on. So that in a nutshell, the application. There are some other brands, and they've categorized all of these, and allow them to change any of the data within this. So they could change this text and the images. I'm going to show you the SharePoint site in a minute to show you how they would actually manage that data.
It's purely a pull tool then, or is it a pull to SharePoint?
No. But with Silverlight bindings, what you can do is you can just switch it to a two-way binding. So if the user wants to edit this information, so for example they're collecting data about the people that they're visiting, with a two-way binding you can quite easily switch into an edit mode, and it would be able to synchronize back with quite a small amount of work. So I'm going to show you what that actually looks like from the user logs in. Yeah. Yeah, so you can generate your entity classes and then you can save them back as well. You can update. So it's basically a load of lists, and it is a SharePoint Foundation solution. So what it allows you to do is just add some brands. So we saw some of the brands there. And as an end user, all I want to do is be able to edit the content quite easily. We had some custom solutions. I don't know if you're familiar with the problem whereby you might want to have a field for an image. So what you do in SharePoint, you actually need to browse to your image library, upload your image, remember the link, and paste it back into the field in SharePoint. So I see some heads nodding. It's a bit of a pain. So we added a custom field, and that's one of the only SharePoint custom fields that we had. But to give you an example, this is how it works. You just basically browse to your image from your desktop, and when I save it, it will get saved to an assets library. That serves me right for going off demo. So yeah, but it basically allows you to browse to a file and do it from the one form. Prevents you needing to try and remember URLs and so on. So list data here is nothing special apart from that, but it means that anything that's changing on a regular basis, such as these key occasions percentages and consumer profiles, and this data is updated regularly. They have a cycle basically, and I think it's a 2-year cycle, but the data is currently up to date, and they like to be able to manage it themselves.
Could you not have done something with PowerPoint and sort of some of the nicer Excel features, such as being able to use the REST API? That?
Yep.
For me, this isn't really working. It's more just pulling information and presenting it nicely. So I can see your point about brand being, attractive and everything, but it seems like you could have maybe, I don't know, maybe done something in PowerPoint with, a theme and pulling information out of SharePoint into there. I don't know. It seems a bit open.
Yeah. Okay. So you could have done something like that. I think that you would need to synchronize it. The sync issue, I'm not sure exactly how well that would have worked when you've got data sets with PowerPoint.
Sure. So you've got things like slide libraries, obviously, that connect back to data sources, and you've got the option to refresh them when you go back. So I don't know how that works with the whole Excel charts and like that. It just seems to me that I'm able to approach it in a similar sort of way.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think you'll find there's always different ways of addressing the same problem. Okay, some lessons learned, some of them painful. SP Metal lookup lists. So we had a situation where we were trying to present a data structure that kind of had a bit of a circular reference, so you do need to be aware that it will blindly try and produce these entity relationships that are non-serializable because of their they're basically got circular references within them. So it's just something to be aware of. And what we ended up doing was excluding certain columns and getting around it by using ID relationships rather than actually the entity relationships. So the cross-domain and client access policy. So one of the things that Silverlight doesn't allow you to do without setting these XML files up is to query data from a web server other than the one it was first installed on or run from. What we needed to do was implement an HTTP handler for that, which outputs the correct code. SL Launcher is basically what hosts the Silverlight application itself. Now, this is not customizable, so we did have some issues trying to work out proxy authentication and browser cache. So SL Launcher, when I launched my out-of-browser application, it was SL Launcher that runs a command line string to execute it. And you can get some issues around that. And the MVVM architecture evaluation. So that was just basically time-consuming. How do you evaluate what the best framework is going to be for your application? And like the gentleman said, there are different ways of solving business problems. And once you decide that you've got a solution, sometimes the architecture, when you're doing things in a slightly different way, takes a bit of time to evaluate. And Silverlight asynchronous exception handling. So what you get in Silverlight is you get asynchronous method calls. What happens if you get an exception at the other end, something happens? It's quite difficult to swallow that up and make it meaningful for the Silverlight application. So what happens if they go offline while they're loading data, for example? What's going to happen and how are we going to be able to handle that? You can use custom message inspectors for that and use faults rather than exceptions. So these were some of the other things that we learnt along the way. And if further info, you can get me on Twitter, Gus Fraser, if you want to ask me any other questions about this particular solution. And that's it, really. Thanks for coming. Are there any more questions about this?